Afternoon. A very warm welcome to our today's webinar. It is co-organized with RESET, the Research Center for the History of Transformations from the University of Vienna. My name is Mario Holzner from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, and I'm very happy to welcome here with us Matthias Morys from the University of York. He is also the director of the Center for Historical, Economic and Related Research in York, with a very nice abbreviation, CHERRY. He will be presenting today the book he edited recently, The Economic History of Central, East and Southeast Europe from 1800 to the present. In the process of producing this book, also the Leibniz Institute in Regensburg for East and Southeast European Studies, IOS, was involved. Well, and an overarching question in a way is, why has Eastern Europe lagged behind the West for so long? And we are very happy to have you here with us and hear from you about, some maybe long-term patterns of economic growth in the region, Central, East and Southeast Europe. So, Matthias Morys, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much to the Vienna Institute for giving me the opportunity to present my book and to present some of my research. So this is for the most part a book presentation, but of course some of my own research went into this book as well, or has emerged out of the book, if you will. Now, this was a very large project, stretching over 5 years, really. And I was very keen on writing an economic history of Eastern Europe that takes the region to the present day. And that also meant that we would draw in people not only from academia, but also from the OECD in Paris. And in fact, we have one contributor from your institute, from the Vienna Institute, that is Dr. Sandor Richter. So this was a total team of 25 authors, and we published this book earlier this year. Good. So let me start here with a comment on the picture I chose for the book cover. So this is a picture, a painting from Konstantin Juon from 1921. He was a Russian avant-garde painter, and he painted ordinary Russian folk trying to create a new planet. So this is the title of this wonderful painting, which hangs in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. And it stands for the optimism of the period, for the optimism that after the devastations of World War I and the Russian Civil War, things could only get better. And this period of the years after World War I for the whole of Central and Eastern Europe stands for the idea that things would get better. And Eastern Europe has found itself so often at these junctions. They are sort of points to which the region returns. And I guess the region, the point that many of us in the audience today think of most is here the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this was now some 3 decades ago. And the idea of the book really is to write a history of Central, East and Southeast Europe, a quarter century, 3 decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and to see where we stand. Why was that period so optimistic, and what were the hopes that people had at the time? Now, I think they are really captured in 2 ideas, one political, the other economic. So the American political scientist Fukuyama expressed that as follows: what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Now, we might laugh a bit about this in 2021 and a bit more about that in a minute, but it is probably what many of us at the time actually thought. It's only that Fukuyama expressed this in very memorable terms. On the economic level, there was a prediction of strong and quick convergence. So when you take one of the popes of modern economic growth, Robert Lucas, he predicted rapid economic convergence, basically reaching advanced Western European levels within 20 to 25 years. Now, I think on both of these accounts, there has been considerable disappointment, and that disappointment really was sort of one of the driving forces for that group of researchers and myself to actually ask, what do we know about the long run of this region? I think on the political front, we do know that history continues, and we do know that liberal democracy is not the end form of human organization, but in fact, liberal democracy has come under intense pressure in very many Central and East European countries, many of which are part of the European Union. Likewise, it's not that clear-cut that all these countries would continue to look towards the West. That's clearly what they did in the 1990s. But since then, the westward orientation has been increasingly challenged in many of them. To make matters worse, we have seen the reemergence of military conflict, something which we thought had come to an end with World War II. So on the political front, there are all sorts of things which clearly contradict that euphoric vision of the early 1990s. This book, for the most part, is about economics. It is an economic history. And here, the disappointment is probably bigger still. In a keyword, catch up has failed, or at least we have only seen very limited convergence of the Central East and Southeast European countries over these 30 years. Now, take an extreme example. Take Germany versus Ukraine. This is a 1-hour flight. This is not more than a full day of driving between these two countries. But when you look at conventional GDP data, you will actually see that Germany has an income level 20 times higher than Ukraine. Now, this number is so large that we don't like it. So we as economists look increasingly at a purchasing power adjusted GDP. But when you do that between Germany and Ukraine, you still end up seeing a difference of factor 6. So the income differences, they have remained really huge. But that's not all. Eastern Europe is one of the parts of the world, is the part of the world that currently faces the strongest sustained demographic decline of any world region. So for many of the countries in the region, we see population declines of more than 1% per year. Now, that's the result of very strong outward migration combined with low fertility. Take a specific example where that has created or is creating a lot of internal political debate, and that is Bulgaria. So in 1990, when the country opens up, it has roughly 9 million inhabitants. It now has 7 million inhabitants. Bulgaria is a country that did not take part in earlier waves of outward migration. So it's actually the first time in its history where the country really has to think about outward migration. And the country basically has a frightful discussion on what to do with outward migration. Is that the end of Bulgaria as we have known it or not? So these are very real problems for many East European countries. And as I said, sort of this combination of political, economic, and demographic factors has led me to assemble this team of researchers and to try to find out what do we actually know about the region. And I think in 1990, we were so optimistic because many of us thought that it was really only state socialism which separated Western and Eastern Europe, but that basically up until that point, there were not fundamental differences in economic development. I just see that there are some have a problem with the acoustics. Let me quickly see that.
I think if people use the reload button, then it will work. So I think it's not the problem on your side, Matthias. So it's
okay.
Yeah, I think.
So are we back on?
Yeah. Please, yeah.
Okay, very good. And where do you think that problem started? Okay, very good. So let's continue. Okay, so basically what we said in 2020, what we said in 2015, a quarter century afterwards, we said, well, look, perhaps there was a wrong assumption we had in 1990, and that was that the only thing that went wrong in Eastern Europe was state socialism. But perhaps the problem is deeper, and perhaps there are much more deeply seated structural differences between Western and Eastern Europe, irrespective of where exactly we want to set that boundary. So the objective is really how far can we actually trace these differences in economic performance between West and East? Well, then, of course, these differences have they increased or decreased over time. So the main objective of the book really is to bring together from very different sources, publications, research groups, in a systematic way, everything we know about economic growth in Central, East, and Southeast Europe. And this feeds into the idea that we want to write a first ever quantitative economic history of Eastern Europe. So of course there is economic history in Eastern Europe, but most of that is descriptive, is very verbal, and we really wanted to put hard numbers to it, hard numbers that allow us to compare the different countries with each other, sort of cross-country, but also countries, one and the same country over time. Now, I think there have been three challenges in this book project. And the first one is that actually there are very, very few people who think of Eastern Europe as a region. So most countries will have country-specific historiographies, and that's very much it. Now, they are often very detailed. They are sometimes very good, but you can't compare them to anything else. There is a little bit of comparative work, but actually the three examples I'm giving you here, starting with Baer and Drunke, and then with the multi-volume book by Casa and Radice, that already, these three are really the only three that there are. So there is not much out there. Secondly, if and when authors, such as the three above, try to choose a regional framework, that regional framework remains very small. And basically, they think of three sub-regions. They think of Central Europe, they think of Eastern Europe, and they think of Southeast Europe. Okay, and sort of we are trying to put all of them together, and we are trying to use that word which has become very widely used since the Cold War period, and that is Eastern Europe. So sort of Eastern Europe is a whole, and then we have these three subregions. And when we started the book project 5 years ago, I, as editor, actually thought that Eastern Europe would win out. But what we have seen is that these three regions make sense, and it makes sense to distinguish between them. And in fact, on many levels, we document that these three regions have re-emerged since the early 1990s, that they continue to have a separate identity, importance, and can be distinguished in a quantitative way from each other in a relatively straightforward way. Good, and then the third point is that quantitative economic history, the way we do it in Western Europe and in Britain and the United States, never really made it into Eastern Europe. It was something of, not of the Cold War, but it emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, and hence could make its way into Eastern Europe only in the 1990s. So, here. Very good. So, there's really one thing we do. We try to treat Eastern Europe as one region and ask the same set of questions for 4 distinct historical periods. Now, let me say a little bit about these 3 points here highlighted in bold. When we say we treat Eastern Europe as one region, we really mean that we try to include all of the countries, irrespective of whether there is a certain historiographical tradition to exclude them. So take an extreme case, take Greece. So Greece has the idea that in its historiography that it is different from the rest of Central, East, and Southeast Europe, and is a sort of unique. And what we are saying in the book is, well, you know, that is actually an interesting question, but we better look at the data, we better look at the history to see whether that is the case or not. And what we find in the book, that for the period 1800 to World War II, Greece can be fully understood and comprehended as part of the region. It follows a very sort of conventional Southeast European paradigm, okay? And there are now many other examples I could give you, but as I said, one of the ideas is exactly to overcome country-specific historiographies and to ask the question for all of them. Same set of questions, yes. So we ask for each of these periods economic growth. How did countries grow? How did their sectors develop over time? We ask about similarities and differences in economic policy. We ask about the economic integration which the East European countries enjoyed among each other, and then with the rest of the world. Now, that rest of the world, that typically means Western Europe, but in the recent period, it can also go beyond that. And then we have 4 distinct historical periods. That is, of course, the long 19th century, the interwar period, state socialism, and the transition period. So this makes 16 chapters, plus then an introduction and a chapter that tries to say something about the early modern period in Eastern Europe. So, for example, take here the chapter of Sander Richter from your institute. So he dealt with the state socialist period and was concerned with the economic integration. So hence his chapter is, for instance, titled Economic Integration within Comecon and with the Western economies. And last historiographical note before going into the findings of the book. As any book, it stands on the shoulders of other books, and I think the most inspirational for me as an editor here was the Cambridge Economic History of Modern Europe, edited by Steve Broadberry and Kevin O'Rourke. They did the same thing about 10 years ago for the whole of Europe. I was part of that project, and I really felt that despite their best attempts, they could not say much about Eastern Europe because not enough was known at the time. So on many levels in this book, I'm trying to fill this gap left by the earlier book. Good. So in current borders, these are the 22 countries we are speaking about. Now, over time, that of course changes. In the 19th century, Austria and Austria-Hungary are of course included, but then this changes in the interwar period. So let me give you sort of the names here of the countries we have. Of course, the numbers, they go up and down, and they mostly go up over time. So we start with 7 countries initially, and then we go to 22. And some of my authors, they really suffered from my insistence on asking the same set of questions for all countries, but this is what we want to get to. And of course, in many cases, we will not be able to give you good data for some of the countries, but then at least we know what we don't know, which we also see as a bit of a value, in the sense that for once we have actually really brought all that together, and we know what we know, and we also know what we don't know, but still do want to know. In some cases, it does not make sense to discuss these countries for some of the periods. I already mentioned here the case of Greece, highlighted in red. Greece we fully include for the 19th century, for the interwar period, as I said, with the finding that it performs in a typical regional manner, but we do exclude Greece starting from the state socialist period. Greece is the only country in the region that does not take part in that experience, and then of course after 1990 cannot be classified as a transition economy. What I'm showing you here is one of the figures that of course will be important in any economic history book, and that is GDP per capita. GDP per capita is and remains the single most important indicator in a long-run comparative framework. And when we say comparative, we have to ask ourselves, to whom are we comparing it to? I think on the European level, sort of appropriate benchmarks are a combination of Britain and Germany as the 2 main industrial countries of Western Europe. I'm showing you here the data for Russia and the Soviet Union. The authors of our long 19th century chapter, Max Schulze and Michael Kopsilis, they were actually able to push back the knowledge we have on Russian GDP. These are these single dots for 1860 and 1870 and then 1880. And perhaps let's not get lost here in the detail. Let's keep a little bit the broad perspective. So we have in blue Britain, and in red Germany, and in green Russia and the Soviet Union. And yes, there is a lot of up and down, certainly a lot of up and down for Germany and for the Soviet Union, which is another way of saying that Britain has had a more stable sort of economic performance over these 2 centuries, and not surprisingly so. But I think the most important thing is probably that the Soviet Union, Russia, does not really reduce its distance to these 2. So if you just look at the difference of the data points for the earliest observation, 1860, abolition of serfdom in Russia, and then 2015, it's roughly the same. So the gap remains. And yes, the gap widens and narrows in distinct periods, but by and large, the gap remains the same. Now, when we do the same thing for our 3 regions, we find the same thing. So what I'm showing you here is data for 1 Central European country, 1 East European country, and 2 Southeast European countries. They are all chosen and based on the idea that we can trace them back a long way in time. So in the case of Hungary, we can go until 1840. And for Russia, as I said, until 1860, abolition of serfdom, sort of one of the main points of Russian political and economic history. And for Bulgaria, Romania, we can basically go back to their independence somewhere in the 1870s. I'm comparing the data here to Britain, and you can see that in all these cases, the numbers, they are somewhere between the upper 20s and the lower 40s, and most of them are somewhere in the 30s. And sort of, if there's one number you want to take away from the presentation, it's this, that the East European countries, they have typically operated at 1/3 of British and German GDP per capita levels, with not a lot of change over time, really. Okay, so I think having brought together all these data series for 2 centuries, we can safely say there is no clear evidence of long-run convergence with Western Europe. Now, that brings me back to my earlier observation that in 1990, we thought only state socialism was a problem, but I think what we do know is that the whole thing is much more deeply seated. And we can try to go back very far in time, and one of the chapters, as I said, tries to push it back to the 16th century, but the differences remain, and they remain quite sizable. Good. Let me mention some more key results. I want to leave a lot of space for discussion at the end, but let me run you through some of the things that I found most interesting when writing my introduction and when going through these 17 chapters which my contributors had delivered. There is a lot of path dependency, including for those countries that have exceeded the regional average. So there are sort of 4 top performers in Eastern Europe: the Czech lands, Bohemia, Slovenia, Latvia, and Estonia. And we can say that with great certainty since the interwar period. And I think for Slovenia, for the Czech lands, we can take it even further back in time. Now, they have a lot of continuity. So incidentally, the countries that were richest in 1938 are today the countries in Eastern Europe that operate the euro. And of course, as we all know, the euro is economic on one level, but also has a very strong element of a political seal of approval. Okay, now, how did they get there? What were kind of the persistent forces working in their favor? Now, these 4, they remain economically far more integrated with Western Europe during the period of state socialism. So while these 4 are actually at the periphery of Eastern Europe, directly located on the Iron Curtain, if you will, they never played it fully the Eastern way. They continued to trade much more with the West than the other parts. Now, this is most strongly the case for Slovenia, which was the most developed part of Yugoslavia, which was the country that had the strongest, the highest degree of openness vis-a-vis Western Europe during the period of state socialism. So when the wall of the Berlin Wall falls, they perform roughly twice as well as the regional average. Regional average, 1/3 of Western levels, these 4, 2/3 of Western level. Well, and then they all play a clever trick. They say to themselves, well, perhaps let's get rid of our poor brothers and sisters and let's seek political independence. So these 4 all engineer processes of political independence from their larger political entities. And then they become the first ones to join the European Union, and they quickly adopt the euro. Now, the one exception is the Czech Republic, but as we all know, the Czech Republic is essentially too proud to adopt the euro. They think they are too good for the euro. So that's sort of a kind of vindication of my story in disguise, if you will. What unites them? My authors have different theories on that, and we are not imposing any specific view on that. But when I read through these many chapters for the many periods, I think market access seems to play an important role. Now, better market access can come through different ways. You can just be close to Western Europe. That's the case of Bohemia. That's the case of Slovenia. Or you can have easy shipping access. Okay, and that's the story of the Baltic countries. So sort of in a polemical way, you can actually say, when you look at the big success story of Latvia and Estonia over a longer period, that the Russian Tsars were really right. I mean, one of the mainstays of Russian political and economic history is the need to get access to the Baltic and the Black Seas. Okay, now that's what Peter the Great tried. That's what Catherine tried. And they were probably right. That does seem to play a role. It is just that the Russians never quite got it the way the Baltic countries achieved that relatively early on. A second point that emerges quite clearly from the book is that these sub-regions matter. I started the book in a very agnostic spirit, and I just said to my authors, well, give me your data and let's discuss it. And being a child of the Cold War myself, I thought Eastern Europe would be stronger than the three subregions, but that's not how it has turned out. Now, speaking to a Vienna-based audience, you will probably not be surprised to hear that Central Europe, in almost all indicators stretching back to 1800, outperforms Eastern Europe and Southeast Europe. Between Eastern Europe and Southeast Europe, the picture is not clear-cut. It depends very much on the indicators, very much on the specific country you look at. But the Central European distinctiveness emerges very clearly, and is very robust. Is very robust throughout these 2 centuries. I think one of the reasons why the regions have re-emerged is because economic geography comes in more strongly again since 1990. So under state socialism, sort of everything folded into one Eastern Europe because the economic geography forces were very different. It was Comecon and so on, was a system centered on the Soviet Union. And since 1990, the big pulling factor of the Western market is there again, which puts Central Europe in a much better position. Incidentally, and that's really the beauty of historical research covering long periods, is that the old explanations and the new explanations are not inconsistent. So the new explanation, which economists have come to like since the fundamental work of Paul Krugman in the 1990s, is market access and economic geography. The old explanation, and of course the justification for why we have these 3 different subregions, is that they mattered because there was a legacy of the old empire, and of course the empire lurking behind Central Europe, that was your empire. So, but empires have their own market access story, and I think this is really what comes in here. So the old Central European Empire, which generated all that history on the Visegrad countries, it now works in favor of countries such as the Czech Republic and Slovakia and gives them much better access. A third point, which I think comes out very clearly, is that there are quite a few political processes in Eastern Europe, which we read about in the media every day, and which political scientists explain through all sorts of ways. But I think when you look at the numbers, they seem to be driven quite strongly by economic factors. I already mentioned the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. But I think the whole very sad story of Ukraine is really explained to a very large degree by two simple economic developments. Ukraine has had a poor economic performance since 1990 compared to its neighboring countries. And then you have economic geography forces which pull the western half to the west and the eastern half to the east. So when you look at the really interesting chapter from our OECD chapter, or from our OECD colleagues on integration since 1990, you see these different forces playing out in different ways. And you see that Ukraine is really stuck in the middle. The tension between the Western pulling force and the Eastern pulling forces are nowhere stronger than in that one country.
Okay, we lost for him.
Yes. I'm sorry. I think I pressed the wrong button. Good. So let me say a little bit more about the explanation. So the book is very strong on documenting differences, and that's what we wanted to achieve. We want to bring all this data together. We want to create space and ability for future research, but of course we also have our own thoughts on it. And I think one of the big discussions in economic growth and economic development over the past 2 decades can be summarized as economic geography, market access stories on the one hand versus institutions on the other hand. I think the book puts a question mark behind the optimistic stories of institutions. Why? Well, look, Eastern Europe has really tried out all possible institutions over these 2 centuries, but the gap to Western Europe has remained the same. Each of the new institutions was justified as a means to converge with Western Europe, but that hasn't happened. So I think there is an issue here that institutionalists would need to explain. Okay, so you see that I'm sort of not trying to go here against these very big heavyweights like Douglas North or James Robertson, but I think we need to ask what these institutions really mean, and perhaps they are more endogenous, more created and influenced by circumstances than many of the institutionalist proponents admit. So I've sometimes been asked, well, look, your book is so strong on market access. So are you telling us here a kind of a pessimistic story in the sense that these countries can't escape, that they will never be like France or Germany? No, I don't think the book's doing that. But I think what we are saying is that if you want to give good policy advice, you need to take long-term patterns into account. And if some of these long-term patterns seem to have to do with market access, you need to think about that. So let me give you a couple of examples for what I think has been good and bad advice for some of the countries. So for example, take Albania. Albania will never become the Czech Republic. It will never have the position of the Czech Republic, which is one of the key countries introducing inputs into the German car manufacturing industry. Albania is just too far away. So better policy advice for Albania is actually to be strong and grow even stronger where it already is strong. So perhaps the nice wallet that you bought last time you were in Florence or Rome actually does not come from Italy, but comes from one of the very many Albanian leather factories, which then ship their stuff to Italy and sell it in Italy for 10 times the price. Likewise, very many Italian companies have their call centers in Albania. Albania has a huge workforce with low wages and excellent knowledge of the Italian language. So I think when we make policy advice to the Central East and Southeast European countries, we really have to see what are the preconditions, and we can't just roll out a template which says producing cars has made Germany rich, so everyone should do it. I don't think this is how it works. It needs to be really fine-tuned to these countries. Likewise, there are some things that these countries might not like, on which they have big debates, but our book seems to suggest you can't stop the process, you can only channel it and go about it in clever ways. And I think one of them is outward migration. So from the data we put together, we do know that the Eastern European countries have experienced strong outward migration throughout, with the one exception of the Iron Curtain period, which was the ultimate blockage to outward migration, of course. This won't stop. You can't legislate successfully against it. Again, I think policy advice needs to be fine-tuned here. So what would be my policy advice to countries that experience population declines of more than 1% per year, which is a very large number? I think twofold. I think one would be integrate more and not less with Western Europe. Join the European Union. What we have seen in the Eastern European countries since 1990 is that the countries that have joined the European Union, they have lost a low skill and high skill workers alike. So the brain drain happens, but it's a kind of equal. Whereas countries that are outside, by and large, well, they lose their doctors and they lose their qualified workforce. So in relative terms, that is probably more problematic than just losing a large chunk of your population. And then I think, well, if history shows that you will experience population decline, you will experience outward migration, try to think of clever ways of staying in contact with them. You see, for example, there are big differences in Eastern Europe on whether the countries allow or do not allow immigrants to vote in the home country. And that does create some attachment if they are allowed to do that. Good. Last but not least, let me say a little bit on the book from a research perspective. I see the book as a starting block and not as something that sort of, let me put another way, I would like to write another book of the same kind in 20 years' time, and in 20 years' time, I would then like to say, well, actually, now we know things much better. That book is really outdated. But we first have to get there, and I hope to create the space with that book. One of the main achievements is that we have moved a lot of unknown unknowns to known unknowns. So we have detected countries, regions, places that have an enormously interesting economic history there for the waiting. And we would invite regional experts to write them with us or in conjunction with someone else or in some form of collaboration or whatever. And I think sort of the most interesting, the most promising known unknown are Latvia and Estonia. So we do know that these two countries, due to seabound travel, have always performed better than many other parts of Eastern Europe, but actually very little is known about them. But what I have realized as editor, whatever indicator my contributors gave me, they looked much better for these two countries than for many other countries, be it social history, economic history, demographic history, really on a very wide range of indicators. Good. Let's leave it here, and I'm very keen on hearing and answering your questions. Thank you.
Matthias, thank you very much. Very interesting. I might add here, given that you talked about data, that WIW together with Reset has started just now a project, a 3-year project, to digitalize all the institute's data from pre-1990, going back even to the 50s. And I hope that probably we can also organize maybe a workshop and similar things to discuss how to actually deal with that data and also how to harmonize maybe the data within the region, but also time-wise with regard to modern nomenclatures. Now, let me also mention that we can now have a discussion in the chat function. On the right-hand side, you can write your questions. I will collect them and read them. There is also a handouts section on the upper right-hand side, and we will upload a voucher for the book so that you can get the book with a rebate. Maybe let me just have a first icebreaker question. With this puzzle that you mentioned about Latvia and Estonia, my puzzle would be even bigger. Where is Poland and Lithuania in this respect? They have also access to the Baltic Sea, which makes me think of, well, maybe the casualties in the Second World War might be an important issue in this respect. You have, in a way, left out the Second World War period. How do you want to deal with this, or how can one deal with it really, and with respect to the last period of your analysis?
Okay, thank you very much. And before I answer the questions, there's one thing that I wanted to say during the presentation, but then I forgot, but I should say it now. So actually, your Vienna Institute played a very, very important role in making Eastern European data accessible to Western Europe and North America during the Cold War period. So some of our chapters, they draw quite heavily on the yearbook published by your institute, I think starting in the 1970s. And that really is a very funny and very interesting story. So the first yearbook was published in the German language. And then the demand from Britain and the United States was so high that starting with the second year, you start publishing that in English because everyone wanted the data. And when I researched that story more in detail, it emerged that sort of Austria was seen as, as a kind of neutral in the Cold War. And then you had a lot of people from Eastern Europe who settled down in Vienna and had access to these countries. So the yearbooks that your institute produced, they are a very, very important source for quantitative economic historians. And I think it's great that you are trying to make this available online. On your questions, one is about the importance of wars, and the other one is about Lithuania and Poland. So, so economic historians have that tendency to downplay the importance of wars for long-run economic development. And I think that is for two reasons. That is, one of our most important indicators is GDP, and we typically do not have GDP data for countries during wartime. And then the second one is economic historians, economists are very interested in convergence. So what we often see is that countries that have a lot of destruction during war, they then recover very quickly after the war. So when you look here, for example, at the one picture I had in my slides, let me show this to all of you. So, for example, look here at the difference between Britain and Germany after World War II. So Germany has many more destructions than Britain in World War II. But that also created a very strong catch-up potential for Germany after World War II. In fact, in the 1970s, it then overtook Britain. So wars are a kind of, a little bit the Cinderellas of economic history, if I may put it this way. On Poland and Lithuania, we don't know an awful lot. It is again a big gap in the literature, which we describe as such. So we describe what we know, and unfortunately, we also describe what we didn't know. I mean, in the Polish case, one of the big problems is, of course, the country emerges only after World War I, so that limits statistics. But I think when we look at, for example, evidence from cities, so evidence from Gdansk, Danzig, then we do see that this was a Baltic port city with the many economic benefits that Baltic port cities had. I think in broader terms, you sort of touch upon a very important issue that continues to impede historical research in Eastern Europe. Who owns the history? So Poland, Lithuania, until the partitions of Poland, the end of the 18th century, was a huge country. It stretched over what is in today's boundaries 8 countries. And it's never quite clear who feels responsible for that, because actually several countries could do it. That is also one of the reasons why the Baltics also fall a bit in a vacuum, because the Russians could do it, but they don't sponsor a lot of research on the Baltic countries. So on Poland, Lithuania, I hope I will be able to tell you more in 10 or 15 years' time.
Okay. There have been a few questions about the reliability of GDP per capita data. On the one hand, especially for the earliest periods in 19th century, and also with regard to the communist era. So a suggestion was, for instance, why not using consumption data as a measure for living standards? And there maybe the picture would be less gloomy. What is your take on this?
Yes. Thank you very much. These are both great questions. So the further back we go in time, the more problematic GDP data becomes. This is very clear. This is something that we all accept. I think, as in so much historical research, we can only try our best, and we can try to push it back in time. Now, in the case of GDP, we have the option to reconstruct GDP from 3 different angles. That's the option that national accounting gives us. So in some cases, we can double check one GDP series with the help of another GDP series. In a 19th century agricultural economy, GDP per capita should still have a very strong connection to wages of agricultural laborers. And that's what we find. And wages of agricultural laborers are relatively reliably recorded. So I would strongly suggest against betting your fortune on 19th century GDP data, but it's relatively okay. GDP during the communist era poses a very big problem. And the main problem here is that GDP will typically be a combination of quantities and prices. So you need to multiply quantities and prices and then add them all up. Now, communist countries, state socialist countries, didn't have prices, because that was the whole idea of allocating by government and not allocating by the market. So what estimates of state socialist GDP often do is that they use Western prices and Eastern data on quantities. This is a very complicated story. For our purposes, we can say that any GDP data you will see for a state socialist economy is an upper bound estimate. Okay, so any story that we present is the best possible one. And even that best possible one, on average, by 1990, does not get above 1/3 of Western European level. So it was probably worse. And I think for those of us Western Europeans who traveled to Eastern Europe in the 1980s, they would think it was worse. But that's from a methodological point, the only honest answer I can give. And then there was the question, should we replace that by other indicators, for example, on consumption? So we have very many of these indicators in the relevant 4 book chapters on the state socialist period. And clearly we should do that. We do it. But actually that data doesn't look better. It sometimes looks worse. And that is because in the state socialist models, there was a very strong focus on forced savings. And these forced savings were then used to have state-led investment into capital-intensive industries. So state socialism, not dissimilar to what China did in the 1990s, early 2000s, is a lot about suppressing consumption for the benefit of kickstarting investment. So consumption data doesn't look very good either. But we have lots of indicators. We also look at physical stature of people in Eastern Europe. And if I may answer it in a nutshell, what we find for the state socialist countries is roughly this. In the 1950s and 60s, they did reasonably well. Even though they never did as well as West European peripheral economies such as Portugal or Greece or Finland or Ireland. Okay. And then starting in the 1970s, the problems of the systems grow bigger, and we really see the East European countries basically derail step by step, so that the endpoint in the late 1980s was programmed really at some point from the mid-1970s. And I think our book pays a lot of attention to the oil crisis, the oil price shock of the 1970s. So we normally think of the oil price shock as something that hit capitalist economies very strongly, for we know it clearly did. But you see, capitalist economies have one advantage, they have the price mechanism. So if the price of one main input factor, energy input factor, changes, there is a system in place to digest it. And what we see in Eastern Europe is that they actually didn't know what to do. So the Russian planners, they didn't know what to do with the massively changed oil prices. And they digested in a less well way, and that greatly contributed to the economic malaise of the 1980s.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There is another question in a way related, probably rather focusing maybe on the period of the 50s, 60s. There is the hint that looking at more recent research on industrialization and rapid convergence, so to speak, particularly if looking at Asia, that indeed institutions and also market access are not sufficient in itself. But if one thinks about Ha-Joon Chang, for instance, taking away the ladder and so on, then probably government intervention in the form of industrial policy, in addition to also the former factors, is something to think about. I have to say I'm quite sympathetic to this comment. How do you see it? Did you find something on the effects of industrial policy?
So, there is a very, very substantial literature on industrial policy pros and cons for the transition economies since 1990, and we are ventilating and discussing this to some degree. But I think the comparative advantage of the book is really to have this very long perspective of 2 centuries. And I think by and large, most contributors to the book, based on their chapters, would probably be skeptical towards industrial policy. And they would probably feel and argue that in a longer term perspective, the best way for the East European countries to grow was actually basically to offer what the countries of Western Europe needed the most. Okay. And so, for example, when we think of, so the OECD, a few years ago, they produced a very interesting study in which they asked a simple question: are the German cars actually German? And what they do is they look at all the input factors and they ask, where do these German cars actually come from? And it turns out that in their analysis, more than 50% of German cars come from abroad, and a very large share comes from the Visegrad countries. So the Visegrad countries, they have really turned themselves into key countries on the Western-led supply chain, in which they make small parts and then sort of further to the West they are put together. Now, when you look at their growth performance, that has clearly benefited them. So my view here is that there is a big difference between economics and politics. I think when you look at the Visegrad countries, the absence of industrial policy and the fact that they have good market access has probably helped them. But some of them have clearly run into political problems with that. And I think this is very clear in the case of Poland. The current government has an explicit industrial strategy, which politically suits the party. If it works economically remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, in a provocative way, one could turn the argument also a little bit around. One could also argue that, at least in the economic terms, Czech Republic might be actually another German Bundesland. But okay, let's maybe not go into this. There is another question. Did the book also look at the cultural dimension, for instance, collectivism and its influence on productivity and institutions?
Yes. So the book is broad, and with the book, we are trying to communicate with a wide range of people. The book is a bit of forgive the word, a bit of a missionizing project. So yes, we are trying to put our sort of economic perspective on many effects, but in order to preach the gospel, we need to know what other schools of thought say and think. And I think in recent years, a field like economic history has also experienced reverse mission, by which we actually learn a lot from other disciplines. So culture has made enormous inroads into economic history and also economics over the past 15 years. And in that sense, we reflect it. I think we have to see again what the book tries to deliver and where it needs to be modest. We want to lay the platform for future research by documenting very well where we stand in 2020. So we relay these debates, but in the case of most chapters, authors explain where research currently stands rather than doing research on their own.
Mm-hmm. There is a specific question on Greece. Why was it a priori excluded for the period after 45? Wouldn't that be an interesting case to see the differential impact of economic systems within a region? And this relates maybe also to the a priori exclusion of Austria, by the way.
Yes. So again, a very good question. So actually on Greece, I always get a question on Greece wherever I present this paper, this book, normally the question is differently. Normally you have a Greek in the audience who asks, how on earth can you ever dare to include Greece into a book on Eastern Europe? Now, today I have the opposite. I think, in fact, one chapter, the chapter on growth for the state socialist period, does include Greece as a very simple counterfactual. And what the chapter says on growth in the state socialist period by Tamas Vonio and Andrei Markiewicz, they say, well, look, we do know that Greece until the late 1930s grew roughly in line with Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, two neighboring countries. So perhaps let's see where Greece stands in 1970. And of course, Greece in 1970 enjoys a much higher GDP per capita than its neighboring countries. However, you see, the 4 chapters on state socialism have research questions that are very specific to state socialist countries. There is a sort of the broad question, how good or bad was state socialism for economic growth? And here you can't, in the detailed questions, include Greece. On Austria, so some chapters for the interwar period actually include Austria. The economic policy chapter, for instance, includes Austria because they say that Austria in the interwar period experiences a couple of problems that are very typical of Eastern Europe. So, for example, the very strong engagement that Austria has with the League of Nations. So the League of Nations, all the loans they basically give to East European countries. One of the most important loans they give is to Austria.
And the first one, I think. No?
Yes, I think so about the first one. So I think on Austria, my answer is the following. So Austria after World War I is the German-speaking lands of former Austria-Hungary. But the German-speaking lands of Austria-Hungary, together with the Czech lands, they were always the economically most advanced parts of the empire. Now, that economically most advanced part leaves. So we could include it, but I don't think we would be able to say anything very interesting, very meaningful, other than that the German-speaking lands of former Austria-Hungary performed very well.
Thank you. We are a little bit running out of time, and there are many, many questions. So I will maybe paraphrase a few of them, and you just pick and maybe give some quick answers to that. There is one comment that actually maybe speaking about institutional path dependency, one would even have to go back to the Black Death and maybe even breakup of the Roman Empire into a Western and Eastern part. Another comment is that whether it is actually worth thinking about leapfrogging for these countries, or whether it's just unrealistic in historic record sense. And maybe a third, does the book encounter economic geography brought by, well, that actually you mentioned. The example is that Branko Milanovic wrote about it for the Balkans, that always lack transport linkages, also due to the specific mountainous terrain, given that the mountains go all the way to the sea, and so to speak, ports don't have a proper connection to the hinterland. Yeah, maybe you want to react on one or two of those.
Yes. I think they are all important, and I think they all highlight specific angles that we have struggled with when writing this book, and that to some extent we have thought about ourselves. So on the Black Death and the very early period, we go back to the 16th century. I'm not aware that there is much research that would allow us to go back further in time. But the Black Death has one important factor here, and that is population densities on the European landmass. So I think we often forget, but we document very well in the book, is that for most of the time, Western Europe was much more populated than Eastern Europe. So it was really only it was only in the interwar period that Eastern Europe actually becomes slightly more populous than Western Europe. But Eastern Europe has a much larger area. So there's far less population density. And actually all parts that excelled economically are those where you have a relatively high population density, largely on the fringes of the system. So these four that I mentioned. So I think future research will need to look into these issues. And of course, they are connected to market access. Okay. And then there was the issue of infrastructure. Yes, infrastructure was a main problem. This is very clear. So when you look at railway densities starting in 1850, they speak a very clear language. And of course, here we have a virtuous circle in some countries and a less helpful circle in other countries. And yes, but I think infrastructure, again, is somehow endogenous to other factors such as lower population density. I mean, if you have higher population, classical case England, you will try to build railways simply because you need to connect all these people. Whereas in Russia, that waits for a long time, largely because it's a vast country with very few people when you look at the bulk of the territory. Okay. On leapfrogging, by which I understand overtaking, we would hope for it, but I think it's more realistic to hope for more convergence. That already would be a success.
This leads me to the following comment, that if you look at the GDP in purchasing power parities, that then the situation looks far better, at least for some of these countries, than, I don't know, Poland would, instead of 33% of the EU average, would then have about 3/4 of it. And I don't know, Czech Republic and Slovenia would be at around 90% of the EU average. So this is something to consider. Another comment questions whether the GDP estimates for the central planned economies really is an upper bound. It could be also that it understates some economic issues like the black economy and so on, and generally also a question which is somehow related, the services sector that typically were not included in the gross material product, and in that sense maybe one could also argue that that is maybe not necessarily an upper bound, but maybe it still has to be really seen.
So perhaps, yes, let me say some of that. So the GDP numbers that most researchers rely on for the state socialist period are actually estimates that go back to estimates by the CIA of the United States. Okay, and these CIA estimates, by the way, they largely go back to your yearbook from the Vienna Institute. So the Vienna Institute produces them based on East European emigres who start working at your institute. They make their way to the United States. The CIA takes them, and the CIA produces these numbers, and that's what we take today. So the question is right in the sense that the material product, as by the socialist philosophy, does not include services, but the CIA estimates well do, because they follow sort of the Western convention on GDP. Size of the black market? Now that is a really interesting question. My sense is that the black market played an important role only in a very small number of countries, but I don't think there's a lot of good quantitative evidence of the black market economy during the state socialist period. So that's clearly promising future research. And then I think Mario, you mentioned the PPP issue. Yes, that's right. So the PPP substantially upgrades the performance of the East European countries, and in particular the Central European countries look very good on the PPP adjustment. I think we are overusing the PPP adjustment, and I think if we always know where it is better to use the adjusted data and where it's better to not use the adjusted data, then it's good that we draw on both. But I think sort of under the influence of, I don't know, widespread coverage by journalists, we have started to actually overuse the PPP adjusted data in situations where we might actually want to go back to the other one.
Okay, then maybe final session. There's another comment that actually maybe industrial policy is really important, was and is important, but that it is maybe very much also relying on sufficiently good institutions. And that the question obviously is, what are really good institutions? And that is probably very context specific and must be embedded in the social fabric. And maybe let me just add a final issue that reiterates this infrastructure issue, because I mean, given that you mentioned that economic geography or geography in general is important, let's say distance to the developed markets. So really infrastructure in transport would be a way to squeeze this distance and make it also, for instance, for countries in the Balkans easier to join the party, so to speak. So wouldn't one policy advice be if the West wants these countries to converge more strongly, to really have a big push in transport infrastructure, maybe even with high-speed trains, for instance?
Yes, I think so. So I think sort of investment infrastructure, history shows, is almost always good. It's not something that I would already see as really industrial policy. I think it's part of something else, or at least part of something broader. So infrastructure, as I said, has been a vital element that is well documented in the 4 chapters of the book that deal with infrastructure developments in Eastern Europe. I mean, industrial policy institutions, I mean, we could fill not only one seminar, but a full seminar series with these very important questions. I think that I think it's quite natural that some countries are trying to implement now more strongly than before a separate industrial policy. I also think that in some cases where Eastern Europe is strong, industrial policy played an important role. So it's kind of well known that Estonia is very strong in information technology. The main reason for that is Estonia was the center of information technology under the late Soviet Union. So they have actually carried a lot of that over. That was then partly helped by proximity to Finland, which also has a strong lag in that industry. So yes, I mean, there are industrial policies which have worked very, very well. But I think there are probably also industrial policies which haven't worked very well. So I think, as I said before, most authors of my book, they were not able to identify a large number of terribly successful industrial policies. That might be different in 2021. Only future can tell. But as I said before, I think a large number, especially of the Central European countries, they have actually been very successful for 3 decades on not following industrial policies, but just follow what the market would suggest.
Okay, Matthias, thank you very much. We are now already almost 80 minutes into our webinar. So this is very interesting. I have seen that also many have downloaded the voucher flyer in the handouts. So I hope the book will be a great success. And yeah, and we are very interested already in the follow-up publication in 10, 20 years from now. And yeah, maybe we can also contribute with our new database that will be accessible to the broad public. Including a digitalization, by the way, also of the publications of the Institute from the 70s to the 90s. So that would be then also the contemporary view included. So this will be hopefully useful also for researchers of your book that you edited. And I want to again congratulate you to this great book. So thank you very much. Thank you to the audience that was with us all the way to the end. And yeah, have a very nice day and a very nice week. And all the best. See you hopefully soon again in our next webinar. Thank you.